Yeah.
Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Atlas Annual Conference. Welcome back. We're really glad to see everyone and we hope everyone had a great day yesterday. This morning we've got a number of things going on, but I just wanted to do a few housekeeping things first of all. Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Atlas Annual Conference. Apologies, let me mute where I'm supposed to mute. Let me tell you about the publishers that we have following the conference this year. So Channelview, Goodfellows and Cabby have all either got things in the Meet the Publishers room or we have sent you emails, so do look out for special offers and information about contacting those. We have uploaded a new version of the program to the Atlas website, so please make sure to check that out as there are a few changes. If you cannot access that, please direct message Leontine or Jantine and they will get a PDF copy of that to you. Also, just to remember that if you want to learn more about the platform Live 2, there is an introducing Live 2 room that you can go to, and Linda from Live 2 is available from 10:30 to 3:30 every day during the conference. Do make use of that and go and talk to Linda and find out a little bit about the platform. Hopefully you've enjoyed using it yesterday and hopefully you can take advantage of it again today. Okay, so this morning we're going to start with an update from some scenario planning, from a scenario planning session that was held yesterday by Albert Postma from Friesland and Martin Groters on tourism as a driver for regional development and collaboration. So Albert, I will pass over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's been a long time that I attended the Atlas conferences. So on the delegate list, I saw many names that I was not familiar with. Of course, there were a few persons that I know from the past, but so it's exciting to be part of the conference again after so many years. And yeah, some months ago, I discussed with Leontine and René to take a kind of alternative route to provide a workshop on scenario planning, something that we do mostly on a day-to-day basis here in the Netherlands. I'm working at NHL Stenden University, and our research department is called European Tourism Futures Institute. It was established 10 years ago to support the business internationally, especially in Europe, with making more sense of the future to prevent the business from surprises, overcoming them. And over the years, we built up a lot of experience, and currently we do a lot of projects also with, for example, World Tourism Organization, WTTC, ETC, ECM, and such kind of bodies, and of course also at the regional level and also at the trade organizations level. And we thought it would be a nice idea to introduce the delegates to the way of working as we do it. And so yesterday it happened. We had a workshop with 9 persons, of which 2 had to leave a little bit earlier. That was Adenike, Francis, Connie Meyer, Kezia, Santi, Joanna, Helen, Marije, and Emily. The interesting point was also that we had an intercultural company, international, so various countries represented, which makes the input for such a workshop quite nice. But it's also good, I think, that the workshop was not too big, because online is a little bit more exhausting for many people. On the other hand, it works quite efficiently. So, well, I will give you an update on how we did it, and therefore I want to share my screen with you, because what we did was working in Mural. And Mural is an online software package that we turned to last year, August in 2020, because we need to provide all the workshops online since that moment. And Mural is a package in which you can design templates and use it for your purpose. But there's also a lot of dozens of existing templates for all kinds of purposes that you could use. anyhow, I designed a template for the workshop, and that, as you can see, it has several parts which constitute or represent the phases that we went through. We started with the key question that was linked to the conference of the theme: how can tourism support the region with development and collaboration? And the first thing that you do in such a scenario planning process is what we refer to as horizon scanning. So we focus on developments and also signals of emerging issues in the macro environment surrounding us that could impact upon the answer to the question. And that could be anything. It could be based on the media, what you read in newspapers, what you read in blogs or vlogs of people, what maybe you notice in the work of artists. So basically what we try to look at in most cases is really at signals that are coming early and indicate a new kind of development or trend. I don't go into the slides that I showed in my introduction, of course, but that would take too much time. But the result of the horizon scanning, as you can see, is here on post-its. So if we see what impacts upon that question that I just mentioned, people refer to climate change, to travel anxiety, over-tourism, more tracking regulations, demand for local food products, fly shame, travel shame, such kind of things. COVID passports increase for local tourism. Well, you can read it yourself. We came up with a lot of different things, as you can see. The next step in the process is that we try to make sense of this world around us. So scenario planning is based on the assumption that the world is basically a system in which almost everything is connected with everything else. And that makes tourism quite vulnerable to change somewhere in that global system. And that means that if you use scenarios, you try to visualize in words and images how the future could look like, so that you can take preparatory actions to take opportunity or advantage of the developments that are upcoming, or you can prevent to become a kind of a victim of these developments. So the second step is that we cluster the observations that we made, and different than what most people are used to in clustering based on themes. We do not cluster theme-wise, but we try to cluster on cause-effect relationships, because we want to know how this world, this system is operating. What kind of small engines, you could say, drive the system that is relevant for the question. That was not an easy task, as it appeared also yesterday, because many things are interrelated, and in the end everything can be clustered because everything is related with each other. But still, then we try to come up with sub-processes, and you can see the clusters here. And we came up with a number of 8 clusters or so. And each cluster in itself represents a process, a cause and effect process that explains a little bit how the world that we're going towards is developing, is emerging. And each of these processes, of course, needs fuel, needs a force that drives it. So the next step was that for each process, together we try to find a label or try to identify the driving force that drives the change that goes on in that process. And these are in the blue post-its with the title highlighted. So we came up with a number of driving forces. One was that Generation Z and A, and Generation Alpha is the children of the millennials, Generation Y. So Generation Z and Alpha and digitalization. Another driving force was the responsible attitude and awareness and values of travelers. Another driving force that we added later because we thought it was missing, it was governance. And then we created a number of additional post-its. One was climate change acceptance. One was COVID pandemic and the growing awareness that is a result of that. Demand for authentic local experiences, environmental awareness, and expectations of consumers that are going up. Of course, you can say many things of these clusters and the driving forces that drive the processes. Some are maybe a little bit related, but normally in a process like this, we take another look at it a few days later, and we try to combine and merge or even split processes to make it really consistent and assure that there's no overlap between the clusters. And the clusters are really pointing at a different process. We did not do that yesterday, so we left it with these driving forces and processes. The next step is that each process, each driving force has an impact upon the future world, and so on the answer to the question that was posed at the beginning. And that it also means, and another issue is that each driving force and process is not of the same uncertainty level. So some outcomes of processes are more predictable than others, and some driving forces and processes are more impactful than others. So what we did is a voting session. You can see that at the top there's a small box with a dot where you can start voting sessions. So people can, participants could yesterday give two choices to the processes of which they thought were most impactful, and two choices of driving forces that they thought would be most unpredictable. And if you sum up the votes, then you get a graph like this. This is an importance by uncertainty matrix. At the bottom, at the horizontal x-axis, you see the unpredictability ranging from low to high. And at the vertical axis, you see the perceived level of impact, also from low to high. And if I counted afterwards the number of votes, then this would be the plot graph that is a result of the voting session. So according to the delegates yesterday, responsible awareness of travelers and expectations of tourists getting up are two factors that do not really matter, do not have a big impact. They're under the median line. So you can, for the moment, neglect them, put them aside, but you could monitor them over the years to come, whether that is going upwards. So that means that we can divide the graph in two halves, so a top half and a bottom half, and the top ones are the ones that really matter for the future of collaboration and regional development by the tourism industry. If we then look at the upper half, we can also divide it in a left and a right half. The left half of the upper level are representing developments, driving forces that represent things that are rather certain, according to the participants. That means that in most cases, they are already in the pipeline, so they are already occurring. In this case, you could say, well, according to the participants yesterday, environmental awareness and the digitalization by generation, Z and Alpha, I made a typo here, is already something that is going on, is rather impactful, and we have to take that into account in any future. However, what really matters, it's the one that are labeled here in green, colored shaded in green, are the two driving forces that both have a high unpredictability and at the same time have a very high impact on the question. And scenarios are made just to get a better understanding of the uncertainty. So what we choose for the scenario cross is the two what we call key uncertainties, or even critical uncertainties. Critical refers to the system again. So critical means that if something happens with these driving forces and the processes underneath, it could change the system entirely. It could cause a kind of tipping point of the system. So these are the ones we need to consider: COVID pandemic and the growing awareness related to that, and the climate change acceptance. I skipped this phase yesterday because time didn't allow, but normally for all the processes we look to the extremes that they could go to in the future. And by the way, we took a time frame of 10 years. But yesterday we only looked at the extremes to which the two critical uncertainties could develop. And then you get a scenario cross like this. Two axes representing the two driving forces, the two critical uncertainties. The COVID pandemic awareness on the one axis and the climate change acceptance on the vertical axis. And then we had a long discussion about what could be the extremes if it's uncertain towards which the COVID pandemic awareness could develop. And then in the end, we concluded that it either could lead to domestic tourism, so all the borders keep being closed, or we get back to the old situation and we have massive international tourism. The vertical axis, climate change acceptance, we had a similar kind of discussion, even longer, because it's also a little bit an academic issue. We do a lot of research into how does this go into the future. Well, we concluded in the end, although maybe not everybody was satisfied with the final conclusion, but local empowerment. So the people generate their own solutions. There's more creativity, and the local communities is in charge. And at the other end, the travel industry decides, or passive citizens dependent on government and industry. So this is the framework of 4 scenarios that could all depict or paint a future for 2030 that is and describes the macro environment in which tourism as a force for regional collaboration and regional development could develop. The first scenario is shaped by international tourism and local community in charge. The second scenario is shaped by local community in charge and domestic tourism, etc. So this is where we ended yesterday. The next step then is to brainstorm about the content of each scenario. So you really should step outside the box and get rid of what we refer to as dominant thinking and your current mindset, and that's not always easy. So we should try to visualize how a world in 2030 could look like if it's entirely shaped by international tourism and the local community in charge. What do we see, etc. So then we can again add all kinds of post-its, and in the end make a nice storyline narrative out of it. And if you do that for all 4 scenarios, then that would mean that again, they should be really different. They should be rather extreme, yet plausible. If I go back to this previous step, it's also important to realize that we do not throw away the other driving forces. So, for example, environmental awareness and Generation Z and Alpha digitalization is something that is already in the pipeline, as I mentioned. And that means that in any scenario, they will be present. However, the context in which they will be present may differ. So that means that, for example, environmental awareness should be taken into account in all 4 scenarios if you write it up in the narrative, but in a different way. Sometimes we have scenario sessions where aging is, for example, such a typical development that is already going on in the Western world. Well, then aging should be present in all 4 scenarios, but in a different context and with different implications. So in this way, we ensure that everything that was brainstormed is represented in the scenarios, but it's basically shaped by the things that we are really uncertain about. And by trying to understanding this uncertainty, trying to look for the limits of the possible, international tourism versus domestic tourism, for example, we try to get a better understanding how the world could look like. And normally the scenarios are not the end of the process, as many people always think. It's basically the starting point, because so far it is based on research and analysis, but the next step is how, or would be, how to prepare your business, your organization, your industry, your trade organization for these scenarios. And that means that you in a group start to think about the implications of each scenario for the party in question, and then try to see which opportunities are opportunities, which implications are threats. And then you can, just as what you normally do after a SWOT analysis, you can try to make sense of these opportunities and threats by developing new business models, new concepts, or new strategies to be prepared for those opportunities and threats. And what we always promote is that you need to try to combine opportunities and threats of all four scenarios. So what most people always think, well, we need to choose a scenario and go further with that, but that's incorrect, because the scenarios represent an exploration of the future. So there is nothing to choose. All of the four scenarios could be emerging, and it could be even elements from different scenarios. So the best strategies or concept or business models are those that prepare the organization for all four scenarios at the same time. And we refer to that as future-proofing. However, there's sometimes large businesses, companies like Shell, for example, they choose for strategies in each of the scenarios separately. And then they can quickly upscale or downscale their activities because they have the money to play with, so to say. But for public bodies, it's usually the best situation to develop strategies that prepare you for all scenarios at the same time, to create robustness. So this is what we did yesterday. The last steps I just explained we did not do. That is something for later. We agreed together to proceed with the process. So the participants who had access yesterday to this template will keep the access over the weeks to come. Martin and me will try to work on the scenarios, and hopefully it results in a nice article that we can publish as a joint publication. So Leontien, this was it. Any questions?
Sarah, maybe you can.
Just looking, sorry. This time I come off. I can't see any questions in the chat at the moment.
Well, no problem. Then it was clear, apparently.
If we get any questions in the chat, I will forward them to you, and if we have time at the end, maybe we can come back to them.
Yeah, all right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to give an update on the process of yesterday, and I think most people really liked it. So yeah, maybe something to repeat. Okay, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Albert. That was a really interesting summary of what happened yesterday, and we look forward to seeing the publication that comes out of it.
Yeah. Right.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for Albert, first of all, for his introduction to the scenario planning. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you Professor Mike Robinson. Mike Robinson was formerly a professor of cultural heritage at the University of Birmingham and director of Ironbridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage. Currently, he is a professor of cultural heritage at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. He was previously the founder and director of the Centre for Tourism and Cultural Change. He remains editor of the Journal of Tourism, Culture and Cultural Change, the Channel View book series of Tourism and Cultural Change, and the Routledge series Heritage, Tourism and Communities. For 30 years, Mike's work focused on the relation between heritage, tourism, culture, and how these realms intersect. Publications relate to world heritage and tourism, heritage and popular culture, the concept of tradition and emotion in tourism. He's an advisor to the UNESCO World Heritage Programme in Sustainable Tourism and the UK's National Commission for UNESCO. He was a government-appointed member of the UK's expert panel to determine the UK's tentative list of World Heritage. Mike has worked on heritage and tourism-related projects in over 40 countries with UNESCO, the European Commission, various state agencies, NGOs, and has long worked on researching, developing, and evaluating cultural routes and itineraries, including those of the Council of Europe. Mike's presentation title is Fragile Promises, Reworking Post-COVID Tourism and Heritage Relationships. Before I give the floor to Mike, I would like to ask you to put your questions into the chat, and we will then, or Mike will then answer the questions. So do not hesitate to put your questions into the chat. So Mike, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Elzbieta, and good morning. A very early morning for me to everybody. My first thanks to the organisers for inviting me to speak, and of course for inviting me to Prague, which bears an uncanny resemblance to my living room, actually. But anyway, I'm with everybody as we all are on Zoom now. This is what we are used to. Let me share my screen with you. I think that should be it. Okay. And yes, surprise, surprise, I'm going to be talking about whatever happens after post-COVID, if we ever get that far. And my focus is upon the cultural heritage sector and its relationship with tourism as a fundamental resource within international tourism. And I'm mainly going to be talking about cultural heritage. Natural heritage is a different but very interesting sort of case as well. And there are some overlaps, but there are some major differences. And what you're seeing now is live streaming imagery from Pisa, just captured this morning on my screen. And I guess I'm going to sort of divide this presentation, as everything tends to be divided into three. If I can move forward, there we are. So So the presentation is part investigation. What I've been trying to do over the past year, I guess, is trying to track, and I continue to do this, the strategies and the tactics that are being adopted by state parties, and in particular the heritage sector, to see sort of how they are thinking about dealing with the aftermath or the presence of the COVID pandemic. So it's, you know, there is some investigation behind this, and I will share with you some of this. Part of it is extrapolation, because the things that I'm going to be talking about are not new. These haven't suddenly emerged with the event of the pandemic. And I think it's important to put this in a wider, longer term time frame. And what the COVID crisis has done, I think, has exposed some ongoing trends. And I think we have to be careful that we don't isolate those things as something very specific just to over the past 18 months. And also part of my presentation is speculation. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. None of us knows what's going to happen in the future. But I can rant a little bit about what I think should happen. And that's what I'll probably end up doing. So if I pick out some themes, and I'm very interested in this phrase, which is being used quite a lot as a sort of a desired state by agencies and governments in particular, but also by businesses, which says, yes, we want business as usual in the international tourism sector. And this image and many similar images, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that's business as usual, or that was business as usual. But of course, beneath the surface, I think we have to look at these longer term implications of COVID, not on just the sort of the dynamics of tourism, the system of tourism or whatever, but on its key fundamental resources. And of course, I'm interested in cultural heritage in this sector. And one of the things that I'm going to pick out is this codependency, this over-dependency of the heritage sector on tourist spending. And how we can rethink and rework how heritage is actually funded. I'm interested in who pays for this. And, you know, we've moved away from, you know, if I think back beyond 30 years, 35 years, when I started sort of working on these issues, the payment issue didn't really come up. You know, we were working within an expanding, growing market. Every presentation I ever went to used to say, yes, by 2020, you know, there will be X billion people traveling around the world, and nobody thought anything about it. And that had a real impact on the funding basis. But there are more fundamental questions here, which I'm interested in, is that when we create heritage, we are the producers of heritage. Communities, societies, individuals are the creators of heritage. What do we do with it? The argument being that we need to think about the ways in which we value it and perhaps re-evaluate it in the future. So that's basically the sort of the key themes I want to talk about. And I'm sure already in your presentations, you will have seen these sorts of headlines. This comes from the UN WTO report on COVID-19 on tourism in 2020, a review. And, these are the headlines, down 74% in terms of tourist arrivals, probably a loss of 1 billion international tourist arrivals, loss in international tourism receipts, 1.3 trillion, and 100 to 100 million direct tourism jobs at risk because of the pandemic. Now, these are just numbers. I mean, for me, they're fairly meaningless numbers. I have no idea really how these numbers really reflect a reality, but they are big, important numbers. And of course, at the global level, they have perhaps less meaning. When you focus in on a little bit in terms of sort of spatial specificities, then these figures start to become more meaningful the more specific you get. Again, I mean, this tells you nothing new in a sense that you don't know. More or less all regions showing this sort of overall decline in tourism activity of around about 74-75%. Some regions slightly affected more than others. What I think, again, if you go into more detail, if we sort of just turn the microscope up a little bit further, then we get a little bit more interesting sort of findings that we can actually talk about. Now, again, this graph just comes from the UNWTO's report. And actually, there's very little discussion about the graph in the report, which I was surprised at in a sense, because I think it shows some interesting things. It shows the tourism as a percentage of various GDPs around the world, and again, there are some things. I mean, there's anomalies in this, and the first anomaly that you see at the top is Macau, down by 48% in terms of tourists, and that's primarily because they closed the casinos, and the majority of Macau's tourism actually comes from casino tourism. And then there's some selected sort of destinations in there, which reflect a very high reliance upon tourism as part of their gross domestic product. Now, these figures relate to all types of tourism. I'm not, they're not just solely based upon heritage tourism. It's the sun and sea tourism, which you would expect. But what it does show is they are very vulnerable destinations, which are highlighting incredible dependency issues upon their tourism. And this vulnerability, this dependency, in a sense, and I haven't gone to this level of detail, but we all know examples of this, that there are vulnerable regions and sub-regions, cities, right the way down to attraction level, which show this sort of this dependency this between tourism and economic performance. And of course, this highlights the sort of systems of governance which are in place in various countries as well. And I mean, I'll just pick out two destinations here because they're the two which possibly interest me the most, because they are Mexico. And although there is a sort of a very big sun and sand aspect to Mexico, there's also Mexico's got a very high concentration of World Heritage sites per capita, and the heritage sector in Mexico has been a very important part of its generating tourism away from the coastal resorts, and so there's again lots of smaller communities dependent upon some of these heritage sites. And the other one I would pick out, and it's a country that I know very well indeed, is Jordan. Again, it's these destinations. I mean, you know, if you take heritage out of Jordan, there's very little in Jordan that is, quite frankly, worth going to see. And Jordan has always had this very high dependency upon its heritage sector, and in turn, the tourism which flows from that. And you know, it's certain times over the past 20 years, the contribution of tourism to Jordan's GDP has been up to 15%. I'll return to Jordan a little bit later. Now, you know, the figures are one thing. What we take notice of are the sort of the headlines, if you like. And, you know, I could have filled pages with headlines regarding the effect of COVID on the heritage sector. These are a selection. They're all taken from March 2020, earlier this year. And I mean, I paraphrased some of the headlines a little bit, but they mainly capture what's been said. Vienna's Albertina losing 1.6 million euros of income a month. Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, loses 81 employees in its visitor services and retail operations. Again, you know, all of these are giving us clues in terms of what's actually happening on the ground. Cleveland Museum of Art loses a third of its employees. Venice, again, I'll say a little bit more about Venice in a moment, but you know, the estimate is about a loss of over 1 billion euros in lost revenue. There's around about 10,000 Venetians in the hotel sector there furloughed. And this I mean, as many furlough schemes are coming to an end, this is going to create some problems. Angkor Wat in Cambodia, 76% loss in tourist revenue. Now, you know, that's massive for a site and the relatively sort of isolated communities around it. And what was a very interesting headline, and I've seen this reflected in a couple of reasonably decent publications, is this realization in Jordan that not just the superficial headlines of Petra loses 90% of its international tourist visits, or the Dead Sea, has to close down for whatever it was, number of months, but something a little bit more deeper, which recognizes Jordan's tourism dependency hits its limits. Now, and this is where the variation in impact comes from. I mean, if you're the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, yeah, it's a big thing if you've got to lose, 81 of your employees. There's around about 2,000 employees in the museum, and again, it's interesting. Again, in the strategic sense, that the loss is at the front line with visitor services and retail in the gift shops. It's not within the curatorial aspects of the museum or the archiving aspects of the museum. But in a sense, if you're in, if you pan out a little bit, if you're in New York, well, there are other things that contribute to the economy of New York. And so there's a little bit of a sort of a safety net within that. In Jordan, and in just around the Nabatean city of Petra, the World Heritage Site of Petra, which is Jordan's main dependent heritage attraction, tourist attraction. There's around it's about 5,400 bed spaces, and they've been running at a 5% occupancy rate, mainly from Turkish workers working on construction projects. So if you're in a community like that, and again, it spans out into that sort of Marne region of Jordan, and then Jordan as a country, you know, who are affected by this? Well, you know, the workers, just about everybody works in the tourism sector. It impacts directly upon families. It also impacts, report out recently about the impact on donkeys and horses, because they're a big part of this tourism setup at Petra. And again, you know, there's a lot of hardship and actually near riots taking place. All because of this tourism dependency. And that tourism is dependent upon visitors going to the World Heritage Site. So again, these are the sorts of headlines that we can see, we can dig deeper on them. I've been doing some very specific work on the specific impact on UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And again, the figures are one thing, but what always grabs the attention are these images, rather than the numbers. They seem to be more meaningful, of just empty heritage sites, empty museums with closed signs written on or whatever. A map was published through the World Heritage Centre again at the beginning of this year, which the closure of World Heritage Sites due to COVID-19, and basically the red sites are the ones which were closed, and it looks there as though the blue sites, the 50% which is open, you know, everything's fine. Now, it's actually a very misleading image, because, you know, a lot of the World Heritage Sites which are suggested as being open are natural heritage sites anyway. And I think also, you know, just because something is open says very little about the funding behind some of these sites and the problems at some of these sites, even if they are closed or partially open. But it also says due to COVID-19. Yes, COVID has illustrated the problems, but the real reasons, I think, go much deeper, and that's what I think we need to look at. Again, it's the sort of the images that have the power to impress here. Again, I'm sure you've all seen images of historic urban centres or big heritage attractions which are basically deserted. So, and again, it's really interesting for somebody who's worked in tourism for a long time. All of these concepts that we've been talking about, and we still talk about, just become irrelevant in a sense. You know, I mean, concepts of visitor management. Well, this is visit management. This is, you know, in St. Mark's Square, you know, carrying capacity, limits of acceptable change, over tourism, you know. These concepts are really seriously challenged out of this, because they relate to this business of growth that we've been used to. And, you know, they're important, you know, don't get me wrong, these are incredibly important concepts to deal with, but they are contingent upon, you know, bigger factors here. And I particularly interested in Venice. I mean, there's so many fascinating things about Venice. Because I was looking at images like this, and then I'm contrasting those images against this, which are the protests of having too many tourists visiting Venice. And, you know, there's only a year between these photographs. You know, Venice is a complicated case. And it's the same people, or many of the same people, who complain about over-tourism in Venice, who are at the same time quite openly and, you know, renting out their rooms on Airbnb. And again, you might have seen this as a headline just recently, you know, and although there's now following the World Heritage Committee this year, there's going to be a change to where the big cruise liners can dock within Venice. Nevertheless, they welcome the first cruise liner post-pandemic, or, you know, sort of in the scheme of adjusting to COVID, came back to Venice just the other week. And it was very interesting because at one side you have protesters saying, you know, this is not what we want. You know, we're trying to get rid of that. You also had a welcoming committee to get for people saying, look, you know, we need the business. Now, this is perfectly rational behavior because, in a sense, if you create this, inter-over-dependency, this is what you get between sort of tourism and the economy. And again, I would extend that because, you know, heritage is the great driver of all of this. And of course, you know, we see these headlines. But, you know, I mean, Venice is quite a big city. It's 250,000 people, and most of the city actually lives not on within the old city, which we think of as Venice, but on the sort of the other side of the lagoon, where, you know, it's responded reasonably well, or as well as anybody else. So again, you know, what's been happening to address these sorts of issues? This is the, again, UNWTO scenarios for what they are worth, which basically are all pointing upwards. And of course, you know, if your, you know, World Tourism Organization isn't going to be bullish about recovery, well, who is? And so, you know, they're all suggesting there's a return to business as usual. With, I mean, it will take, recovery rates will vary in different places, but you know, the upshot of the graph is this upward curve, and an estimate of around about sort of 3 to 4 years, and somehow things will be back to normal. In the meantime, what I'm interested in is the impacts on the heritage sector as part of all this, is, if you like, the underpinning of not all of it, but a big chunk of it. And when we look at the impacts on heritage sites, well, again, there is considerable variation, and we have to sort of take that into account. And again, you know, we can extrapolate and talk about, you know, the difference between the developed world and the developing world. We can talk about different systems of governance. We can talk about the different varieties and different categories of heritage that we're talking about here. But, you know, there is considerable variation. But overall, there has been this dramatic drop in tourism revenue, both in terms of entrance fees, donations, indirect spend, and this sort of trickle down, which we all know about, this trickle down visitor spend in local communities and the wider destinations. So again, this interlinking this destination approach is all sort of being affected by this drop in tourism revenue. You've got no tourists, you've got no revenue. The impacts in terms of, in an organizational sense, has been on decreased staffing. It's not only the spending, but I mean, that's part of it, but also the sort of the just lack of access in some cases due to COVID has prevented monitoring of site conditions. It's certainly prevented and interfered with sort of, remedial conservation work. In some parts of the world, it's resulted in a rise of looting and generally illegal activity due to lack of security. Some of these sites, some heritage sites have just been abandoned in some parts of the world because there's just nobody there to stop people going in or out. At the same time, and one of the things with heritage is that it's old. It always gets more costly as years go on to maintain it. So the maintenance cost, whether it's open or closed, are always there. And although you can reduce these, they still apply. And there are some hefty maintenance bills that have come in even over a year of, even over a period of closure over a few months. And of course, there's the other impact is the long-term decrease in spending allocations on heritage, and most of this is actually unknown. What we are looking at now are the stopgap measures, whether it's a furlough or whether it's a sort of a rescue recovery packages which have been put forward by various authorities, but they're really sort of just very much in the immediate term and not in the sort of the long term. There's an increasing number of studies being carried out on these impacts, and they continue to be. This is one which was undertaken by Historic England, the statutory body for looking after heritage in England. And I just like this because it starts to go into some detail about the impacts and the effects, and also it was a good sample size. I mean most of this is focused on SMEs and micro businesses. It looked at around about 100 large organizations, but also about 15 or 16 sort of large organizations, but the majority related to the sort of micro businesses, and also the volunteer sector. And the volunteer sector starts to become really important in our minds, particularly in England, in the UK. Again, it varies from place to place. In some cases, the volunteer concept doesn't really exist. But if we look at some of the effects, well, again, loss or postponement of work affecting 76%. Income generating plans, staff on furlough. Interesting, the additional costs of investment in IT. And again, we're all sitting on our Zooming on our laptops here, but there has had to be an investment in this. Volunteers, lack of available volunteers. Well, it's somebody told me the other day with a small organization I've worked with, saying that 6 of their volunteers, and their volunteers tend to be over the age of 65, have died in the past year because of COVID. So this is a very direct sort of impact. And again, delayed payments, layoff of staff, And again, that's with the furlough system. If there wasn't a furlough system in place, that would have been much greater. So this is many sort of organizations have been looking at these more detailed effects on the heritage sector. And of course, many of them are recommending putting in place measures for recovery. This awful phrase "build back," which I don't like, but never mind. So, you know, UNESCO, ICOM, International Commission of Museums, the Network for European Museum Organizations, OECD, they've all come back with some sort of, analysis of what the impact is on the heritage and wider cultural sector, and they're all sort of starting to suggest ways that this can be looked at in the future. And in most cases, state parties have put in place some sort of recovery package, and it tends to come. It's usually directed through a Ministry of Culture. It's a cultural recovery package. It's not specifically heritage, so I guess it is if you widen it out to intangibles, but it involves the theatres, the movie industry, etc., etc. The focus has tended to be on the larger sites, larger heritage sites and museums, and of course, this funding was very welcome. It's been welcomed in many parts of the world where it's been offered, but of course, it's never going to be enough. This is always to just try and make up ground which has been lost over the last 18 months. The travel and tourism sector is far more problematic for governments to support. There have been furlough systems in place, but they have been selective. Many of the, as you know, most of the travel and tourism sector is made up of SMEs anyway. And politically, it's much more difficult for governments to support the private sector. And that's where the airlines are crying out for support. But it's actually very difficult for governments politically to do this. So this has been an issue as well. And as highlighted on this graph earlier from UNWTO, it's a suggested 4-year recovery time for the global tourism sector. Now, I don't say that at all. I think there are much more deep-rooted issues which are going to make this recovery a long, long time coming, if it ever comes at all. UNESCO have responded to the crisis with regard to sort of, again, heritage and wider culture within its sort of areas of domains. And I won't go into detail. There's a lot of text on this on this slide, far too much text on this slide. But they've published a report. You can see it online, and it was published, I think, October last year. And things are very fluid, as you would expect. And this is what the range of measures that have been put forward for dealing with this. So, just to highlight a few, well, there's been an online exhibition of World Heritage in partnership with Google Arts and Culture. Well, I mean, if I want to look at a World Heritage site online, I don't really have to sort of go to a specific online exhibition. But that was one of the initiatives. There's also, and I put the link on there, a fascinating sort of little montage of selected World Heritage Site managers talking about the impacts. It's very interesting to look at those, because some of them are really desperate. Some of them are really crying out and saying, look how bad this is. Others are saying, yes, this is no problem, and they are very much speaking to their political masters, I guess, to say, look, there's not a real problem in here, and business is good really, and it's going to get better very soon. And then there's a great initiative which has got some children to draw some pictures of some World Heritage properties. Excuse my cynicism, but I don't think that gets us very far. And also there was a meeting of cultural ministers. I just say one thing about this, because I thought this was a very interesting sort of event. So you had about 150 cultural ministries represented online, this massive Zoom event, I think back in April last year. And of course, what did they say? Well, they said, cultural sector is really important. Culture is a vital part of the solution to this pandemic. All of them said, well, we have a funding package. We have a funding package. We are looking at recovery. One aspect which came across a lot, and again, it's this, it's seen to be a sort of a way of dealing with the impact on the COVID impact on the heritage sector, is that we need to think digitally. And one of the quotations was, we need to cooperate with television stations, radio and press, and to ensure that people can connect with culture as a source of comfort, well-being, and togetherness during these traumatic times. Well, is this really what happens? I mean, really, this is the bland leading the bland, I'm afraid. But there is nothing in this meeting, and there was very little in this document, which related to the importance of tourism as a way of generating income, which gets people working again and gets the heritage sector working again. This is outside, if you like, of the comfort zone of UNESCO. And what was suggested really, and again, and in part, this is, UNESCO is a secretariat. The state parties have to be ultimately responsible for any action regarding their culture and heritage, and indeed their tourism. And there is considerable variation amongst this. Tourism is not part of the realm of UNESCO. It deals with it in a sense. It's particularly concerned with the over-tourism bit, but where's the over-tourism at the moment? And the focus, again, appears to be getting back to business as usual, or sort of a new normal, as they call it. And of course, what we had in Fuzhou in July was the World Heritage Committee met, and there were more designations on the World Heritage list. Now, it is right that the purpose of designating World Heritage is protection, not to stimulate tourism. That's what it tells us in the 1972 convention. But of course, periodic reporting and just observation, common observation, tells us that most countries around the world want World Heritage sites. They want to be inscribed on the World Heritage list precisely because they are recognized as being a way to stimulate tourism. So again, forgive my cynicism here, but I don't think this is really dealing with the issues. And I mentioned the virtual, I call it the digital distraction. I'm tired of digital everything. But you know, there's a suggestion that the sort of the virtual, the digital is a way of sort of getting away from this COVID crisis within the heritage sector. So we put more things online. And you know, there's no doubt. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong. There's no doubt that the digital heritage, use of virtual reality, augmented reality, blah blah. It's interesting. It's helpful, but it's a distraction. It's a distraction from the funding problems. Where are the revenue streams attached to this? How can you actually, you know, you can employ more people. Who pays for them? Where's the revenue coming back from all of this? And I don't know about you, but, you know, during times of lockdown, you know, was I sort of sitting looking at new digitized versions of some World Heritage site somewhere? Perhaps I should have been. No, I was watching Netflix, which is that's the digital distraction in a sense. So so I feel this is a little bit of a what we would say a red herring in the process. So what has the last 18 months shown us in terms of this relationship between tourism, heritage, the cultural sector? Well, you know, it's shown, and it still is demonstrating, this over-dependency on tourism as a foreign income generator. This is a serious problem for heritage sites. And yes, domestic tourism, of course, domestic tourism. You know, domestic tourism is always there, but you know, for many economies, that doesn't solve any problems. That just redistributes income. That just you know, it doesn't bring new income into the country, into the region, into the attraction. These intimate dependencies between the heritage and tourism sector, which I think the tourism sector understands far better than the heritage sector. In fact, I know that's the case. There is this over-dependency of the heritage sector on public subsidy. And again, this varies considerably around the world. If you're in I was going to say in continental Europe now, because, you know, I'm obviously not part of continental Europe anymore. You know, heritage is mainly publicly funded. By no means 100%, but a lot of it is. If I'm in the UK, and particularly if I'm in the States, the subsidies come from, or the funding comes from private and independent and voluntary sectors. It's also exposed this over-dependency, and again, I'm speaking mostly in a UK sense, but in other parts of the world as well. An over-dependency on the heritage sector on volunteers and fundraising. I mean, if people didn't volunteer to restore old engines or restore old buildings or act as guides, or, you know, and now every museum has a fundraising manager, and fundraising managers have had nothing else, nothing to do over the past 18 months. Where the funds come from? But you know, if they're stopped, well, the heritage sector breaks down. And also this just lack of business strategy and enterprise skills in the heritage sector. Now, this is something we've always known. And you know, it's always fascinating to talk to people in the heritage sector. And this has only come relatively recently to many heritage organizations, you know, who clearly dedicated and understand the sort of the you know, the archaeology, the art history or whatever, but, you know, how does this work in a sort of in an economic sense? How does this work in a financial sense? How does this work in terms of, you know, the wider enterprise economies that we sort of work in? This remains a big issue. But the important thing is here, although I'm saying this is exposing cracks which were already there, so that the fact that COVID caused this is a misnomer. These are part of a longer term and perhaps an intractable problem. And again, you know, work which has been going on before shows the problems that the heritage sector have had before COVID, and all the pandemic has done is just accentuate those things, bring them to the surface. And so, and again, in the UK from year 2000 until now, the state-run museum sector has seen a decline of 14%. 5% have closed, 9% transferred to trust status. Everybody's moving to trust status. The pressures on local authorities, municipal funding to support local museums. Every local authority is really struggling financially, you know, and as we know, culture and heritage is at the bottom of the list, you know, health, education, you know, transport, top of the list. And, you know, I do see this pictures worsening across the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. Something which I'm slightly involved in is the again, Historic England, the statutory body of England, has a heritage at risk register, and it's never been fuller. You know, there's about 5,500 heritage sites which are in danger of being lost. And when I say lost, I mean literally falling down due to a lack of funding. Now, other you know, there are other examples from other parts of the world, and you will know them better than I do. But this risk register has been there for a long time. You know, these are just not new problems. This is a long-term problem, and all that COVID has done is just sort of highlighted that. Now, I wanted to show, because this is a compounding problem, that we continue to produce more heritage. And I couldn't think of an image to do this. So you've got some rabbits, because they seem to be symbolic of mass reproduction and ongoing production. But, you know, if we are creating more heritage, and of course there is more heritage in the world today than there was yesterday. There are more sites being listed around the world. There are more sites inscribed on the World Heritage List every year, on the Intangible Cultural Heritage Representative List, etc., etc. We continue to produce more and more heritage. And, you know, a figure which always stays in my mind, back in 1970, in the UK, there were about 300 registered museums in 1970, you know, and now there are over 4,000. So what you have is a growth, an unchecked growth for good reasons. I mean, I'm not knocking the reasons for this, but, you know, we continue to add to the problem in a sense. So the heritage sector increases, but the resource for funding it is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and that seems to me sort of basic economics. So some reflections, because I'm going to wind up in a moment. So we've got this continual production of heritage. We've got this reduced funding to tourist-dependent heritage sites. Again, no tourists, no income. We've got also reduced funding by the public sector. and we can see this around the world. Cultural budgets are being reduced or diverted. They're not necessarily being cut, but the focus is on priority recovery measures. And what will happen in the future, and this is the great sad thing about the pandemic will be paid for by future generations. The level of debt servicing, the interest to service these massive borrowings that have been taking place will continue with us way beyond my lifetime. There have been few state concessions to the largely private sector-led tourism business, and airlines are important here. If you don't, we've lived in a low-cost, cheap flight boom, which has really stimulated European tourism. And where do we fly to? Well, we fly to the Venices and the Florences and the Barcelonas, where the heritage is. We follow the heritage. And there's still this limited understanding of the importance of tourist income amongst large sections of the heritage sector. And I frame this as a sort of almost a culture of denial. Somehow that heritage and culture is above everything else, and it demands our attention. Now, if I watch my TV, I am bombarded now with advertisements that I have to fund every charity around the world. I'm already paying for pandas and leopards and eyesight hospitals in Africa, etc., etc. And heritage. Okay, this is where this is the rant. This is the speculation. I think these are fundamental issues. It's not. This is not for any recovery sticking plaster. The heritage sector is living beyond its means. So what do we do about that? Well, again, we do need more effective and creative engagement between the cultural heritage sector and the tourism business. So many examples where people just don't talk to one another. Those who know, those who don't. And also, and this is where it gets a little bit provocative and deliberately so, we need to think heritage priorities in relation to budgets and tourist audiences. And when I'm talking about tourist audiences, I'm talking about, not just in terms of size, but in terms of what they want to see in terms of heritage. And I may be wrong here, but, I think what we'll perhaps end up with in the longer term is greater consolidation within the museum sector. Amalgamation of large museums, small museums, provincial museums maybe banding together for cost efficiencies. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that could be quite a liberating thing. Lots of small museums are already closing and perhaps will close in the future. What happens to collections? Visit your local museum, visit your city museum, look at the objects in the museum, ask yourself the question, who do these objects belong to? Because how do we dispose of these? And there's been various cases about, and increasing cases about how we dispose. I've got no problem with disposing collections within local communities, getting them out. You go to Schiphol Airport, you see the Rijksmuseum has a little museum in the airport. Why don't we have museums in other parts of the community? We don't have to have these big edifices that we've got to pay for. Adaptive reuse of sites with market potential. Well, adaptive reuse is a very good strategy with regard to some heritage buildings. But we do have to think more about, and more, let's say, dramatically about turning our heritage into housing, into hotels, into industrial units. Yeah, and it's for sale, you know. Sell it off. We don't have to keep everything. I don't know whether you ever had parents who tell you can't keep everything. You have to throw things away. And so, I've been doing a lot of work, which I call palliative care for some heritage sites, which you realize you can't save them. There's no money to save them. So, you can record them. We can record them very well now, and we can slowly let them decline, and we build other things, we do other things. So, I mean, a lot of this is heresy to my colleagues in the heritage sector, but I think we really need to debate some of this. So, I leave you with that, and yeah, maybe that's somebody wants to buy a big pile of stones in the UK with some development potential, I think, around them. But I'll stop there. Very happy to have questions. Thank you for hearing my rant, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike, for your interesting presentation. Yes, we have some questions. So first question came from Kiziam Kwizu, and she said, interesting how COVID has disrupted the development of the concept of over-tourism. Should scholars now engage more research on under-tourism as a way forward?
Depending where you are in the world, yes. I mean, over-tourism is a very, it relates to a lot of high-profile sites, and I fall into the trap as much as anybody else. What do? You invoke Venice and Barcelona, and the usual suspects here about over-tourism. But if you look at the World Heritage List, for instance, whatever there is, 1156 World Heritage Sites in the world. Actually, if you look at the numbers of visitors, over-tourism only really affects a very small percentage. So many World Heritage Sites are crying out for tourists, particularly in more developing countries as well. So I think where over-tourism happens, has happened and has the potential to happen, and we know probably those sites, then yes, we need to look at visitor management strategies, digitization, diversification strategies, etc., limits of acceptable change, blah blah. But in lots of places, local people are crying out for tourists, and and this dependency swings very quickly both ways. So if you take the example of Petra, where just in 2019 they were topping 1 million visitors, and people were getting very worried about over tourism in Petra in Jordan, and you move from that to now where you had probably less than 5,000 visitors, and that's devastating for the economy. But if we get used to it, if that's all we have, what do we do about it? That's a major structural problem.
Thank you. The next question came from Greg Richards, and he says, the term build back also suggests an emphasis on physical structures, but aren't the software or orgware elements of the system more vulnerable? Perhaps we need a new term, create back or something.
Yeah, I mean, build back, I hate the term build back. It was used by Boris Johnson, and it means nothing. It's a meaningless statement. I was just sort of ironically using it. I think, yes, I mean, if you want to put a prefix before it, yeah, be far more creative and be far more radical, because what we've experienced and what we're still experiencing now is something which is unprecedented. So the idea that you can just sort of I don't know, carry on doing the same things is just nonsense. So yeah, I mean, I fully agree. Use the term creative, or at least be creative in what you do. The term is a different matter.
Thank you. The next question is from Melanie Smith. She says, "Great to hear you speak, Mike. Really thought-provoking. So hard for those countries whose image is almost synonymous with their World Heritage Site. I wonder if they need to rethink their image and branding strategies too."
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, I mean, I guess they do. The problem with that is, how do you deconstruct that? How do you not think about Barcelona without thinking about Gaudi, or vice versa? How do you not think about Paris without thinking of Eiffel Tower? How do you not think about Rome without thinking of the Forum and the Colosseum? And so I mean, well, as you know, I mean, in tourism terms, rebranding at a certain level is incredibly risky. And many years ago, I remembered when there used to be a British tourist authority. The big flagship brochure always used to have the Tower of London on the front, or London Bridge, or a beefeater, or something incredibly sort of highly symbolic of sort of ye old England. And then one year they put on a mini car on the front, and nobody understood that. Nobody got that in an overseas market. So I mean, I think you're right, but I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and I'm not so bothered actually about the sort of the national brands, but I think at a local level, and particularly at a sort of an institutional level, yes, there's quite a lot of rebranding to be done, but brand is based on value, and you have to sort of get to grips with the value first. So I hope that sort of addresses what you're asked.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Elka Dogramadieva. In normal circumstances, besides the pandemic, how could the issue of overdependency of the heritage sector on public subsidy and fundraising be solved without entering the trap of over-tourism?
Yeah, well, over-dependency on tourism. I mean, that's a really fundamental issue. And one of the, what you do when you try to tackle this notion of over-tourism is you try to battle against human nature. You get to the sense, if I'm coming from China to Europe, what do I want to see? I want to see Versailles. I want to see, the Tower of London. I want to see the headlines. And this does relate to branding, but what do we do about it? In terms of, if we really want to sort of start to sort of change things, yeah, and again, I've written about this many years ago. Have other things for people to do. Tourism is basically based upon people's desire to consume, not necessarily to produce. What do you produce? Introduce new industries. Have inward investment. I don't know. Make electric cars. Make wind turbines. Do something else. Not everywhere can be a tourist destination, and although the employment is quick and easy, low barriers to entry, etc., etc. That's why we had this. You've got to put this in the long-term historical perspective. The reason why there's so much tourism in many parts of the world is because of major structural decline in other forms of the productive sectors. So, tourism was a response, and we've just become used to it, and it suits us to an extent because it isn't polluting in the same way as a coal mine was or a chemical plant was. But if we really want to get to grips with over dependency on tourism, we have to do other things outside of the sector. I'll just give you a small example, because in Jordan at the moment, in Wadi Fainan, it's near the Danya, there's a nature reserve. And there's a planning application gone into to open a copper mine. Nearby, and the copper mine, and this is a very poor part of Jordan, the copper mine will bring serious employment and well-paid workers into the area. And yet there is a petition to say this shouldn't happen because the nature reserve is important. Well, the people who are signing this petition are all from outside of Jordan. They're all sort of middle-class academics. They're not people who live in the local area and who, if they are lucky, have got a job as one of the few tourist guides around the nature reserve. I mean, I'm not saying this is a there are easy ways forward here, but this is jobs or flowers. This is these are well-rehearsed arguments. So it is very difficult. I'm afraid to diversify. Once you invent something and people buy into it in such a way, and we all have. That's why we're all here. It's very difficult to disinvent that.
We have the last question here from, and I apologize for the pronunciation of the name, Erdinç Çekmek. As you know very well, tourism heritage is a highly political issue. The paradoxical question remains, whose heritage will be protected and who will decide this?
Oh, I agree entirely, of course. But what we've had is and again, you can look at the strategies, and I refer to this in a sense. You can look at the recovery strategies of which heritage sites are getting the money to sort them out through the pandemic crisis, and it's the large sites, the high-profile sites. You could argue that they're precisely the sites that don't need protecting. I mean, in the UK, the cultural recovery package. I don't know, somebody on the radio the other day saying, "Oh yes, it's fantastic. The opera really needs to be supported." I couldn't care. I'm not bothered about the opera getting supported. Again, that's somebody making a decision, a value decision, political decision about what's more important in people's lives. What has happened, I think it's really important to say this because I talked about this ongoing production about heritage, is that heritage has democratized. What are important to people are not necessarily the big cultural sites, the big high profile. It's their own intimate heritages. It's your personal heritages. It's your roots. It's the heritage of popular culture. It's things which relate to us as a contemporary society. And so I think there are going to be political decisions made about what's supported, what's not supported, it was always the case, but yes, you're quite right. It is about whose heritage, but people have started to take that into their own hands a little bit, I think, and and quite rightly so.
So thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much for the presentation, which was very interesting. And of course, thank you very much also for participants for questions. Before I pass the word to Tara, I would like to invite all of you to the virtual online Prague city tour, which will happen at 1:00 p.m. If you go to main conference hall, you will be able to watch this virtual city tour. So you are cordially invited. Thank you very much. And I wish all of you a friendly and stimulating day.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Elżbieta. What I'd like to do now is welcome Angela Wright from Munster University to talk about next year's conference. Angela, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. I'd just like to say thanks to Mike first for a really fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. And of course, a lot of the issues and concepts really resonated with us here too in Ireland with COVID-19, etc. So as Tara said, thank you, Tara. My name is Angela Wright and I am from Munster Technological University in the south of Ireland. And I'm so delighted to let you know that we will be hosting next year's Atlas Tourism Conference in our university in Cork. Now, the title of the conference, as a lot of you might know, you might have seen it on the website already, is Tourism 2022 and Beyond, What Matters Now to the Global Tourist. And we very much welcome your participation in this conference. So the conference is really important to us as tourism is a vital industry for Ireland. For example, pre-COVID 2019, Ireland welcomed 11.3 million visitors, and this contributed 5.3 billion to the Irish economy and supported 325,000 jobs. So as you can see, it's really, as you know, relating back to Mike there, we're very much driven by tourism in Ireland. So I am delighted to let you know that we have a very exciting lineup for you, of course, both academically and socially, which is very important too. So we already have superb keynote speakers secured for you. For example, Professor Dimitrios Bohalis, who is now currently the visiting professor at the School of Hotel and Tourism Management at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. And also Mr. Niall Gibbons, who is CEO of Tourism Ireland. And that is the international body for promoting Irish tourism in the international arena. This organisation, Tourism Ireland, has 14 offices in 21 countries with 168 staff. So we really are really hoping that we can welcome you in person to our beautiful part of the world in the south next September. So our weather is great this time of the year. At the moment, we have 24 degrees, which is great. So we're really delighted, sunny days and warm, you know, very nice for people and to welcome you. Now, also just to let you know about access. So we have very good access from Europe into Cork International Airport. And that international airport is only 20 minutes from the university. And that airport also services Heathrow 3 times a day. So if you're coming from, you know, maybe America or further, you can come via Heathrow to Cork. Now, we also have Dublin Airport, which is our international airport, which is 3 hours away. So there are many connections in there. So you definitely will have good access. Now, I'd like to give you a flavor of what you can expect. So I'd like to play a video that will showcase us, the university, the region, and what you can expect next September. So thank you very much indeed. And myself and my colleagues are really looking forward to welcoming you. And we really hope and pray that this will be in person. And no doubt it will. So thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen now, please, with you. So hopefully this will work. Share my screen. And you can let me know if you can't see this. Share. So here we go. Tara, you might give me a thumbs up. So there you go, everybody. So I hope that gives you an idea of what you can expect, and we look forward to seeing you. So if anyone would like to ask me any questions about Cork or anything, any concerns or anything, feel free or send me an email or a message. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day. It's a great conference. Thanks to Leontine, Tara, and Jantine.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks to everyone who's spoken this morning. We hope to see you in Cork next year. We hope that we get there. Okay, it is now about 11:15. The sessions will start back at 11 o'clock, so we will see you there. Please take the time to join us in the coffee break room, stand up, have a stretch, get a coffee or a tea or whatever beverage, depending on what time zone you're in. And we will see you back in the session shortly. Thanks again, and see you all very soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Tara.